So far, we have discussed various topics in the horror genre, but for a long time I wanted to explore one aspect of the horror genre that has different opinions around it. Action elements are one of the main identity parts of the horror genre, especially survival horror, which has experienced many ups and downs over the past decade. Action elements like a double-edged sword can both reinforce and complement the elements of fear and can completely disintegrate them with only a very narrow line of distance. We will continue to break down the types of action in the horror genre titles and examine on a case-by-case basis whether action is a need for horror works or whether it is better to be abandoned altogether, like many other games in today's noisy genre, and simply deal with fear. Before we get into the topic, it's best to ask first, what is fear? In simple terms, fear is the reaction of us humans and many other living things to events that cause us to feel a danger or threat to ourselves. The feeling of fear may not necessarily be pleasant to many, but the changes it makes to our bodies are truly extraordinary. In the first place, when we fear, our body's defense mechanism completely changes our neural and psychological structure and activates the survival instinct. Depending on the situation, the person may become aggressive and attack the danger, or try to get as far away from danger as possible in any way he can, also known as the fight or flight response. After the nervous system is engaged, the body's physical properties are also boosted by hormones such as cortisol and adrenaline, allowing a person to fight or escape more efficiently, qualities that you might not even know if you normally existed. In addition, your blood pressure also increases and your breath becomes faster. Stress and fear also affect and change the body's blood flow system. In this case, blood flow is diverted from the heart and focused on different organs, which results in your overall performance in fear going beyond what you normally have. In scenarios that create fear, there are many elements that are very effective in making them more frightening and can actually be cited as the main drivers of this feeling. The sound, the darkness, the environment you're in, the neurological reactions that cause the hallucinations, and the danger that you're dealing with are all like a chain that wraps around your neck and makes it difficult to breathe. So it can be said to some extent that fear doesn't necessarily have something to do with whether you have something to defend yourself, because it first creates a sense of self-defense, and responding to these elements of self-defense and escaping is discussed. It's worth noting that the degree of fear about an issue, person, existence, or event in people varies according to their culture, life, and personality, and therefore how they react to it will be completely specific to each person, so that you may find one thing very scary while the other doesn't feel it. Now that we have a general understanding of how fear works, I think it's easier to figure out how to use it, and different approaches to it in different games. So let's take a closer look at the fight-or-flight rule and how fear works. If we want to refer to the history of action elements in horror works, as during the series of Bloody Stairs videos, we can see that these elements were an important part of this genre from almost the beginning, so that even a simple title like Haunted House somehow provided defensive items to the player. However, today there are a lot of people who have known action as stranger to the horror genre. Of course, from those years to today, how to use action elements in horror games has also undergone many changes, which alone has caused the creation of different subcategories for the genre, which will be briefly addressed to each of them. It is worth mentioning that choice matter works such as Until Dawn will not be mentioned, as these titles focus entirely on the narrative of the story and do not necessarily fit into our discussion today, because the gameplay has a completely different purpose. The first style that was a guest of action elements that actually kept it in its heart was the survival horror branch, which can also be referred to as the genre's main branch. When we hear about the genre, Resident Evil is definitely the first name we visualize, and then add names like Alone in the Dark or Silent Hill. A simple look at the fathers of the horror genre in general shows that action elements have always been a very important part of the game's experience. The important point is that these elements were a stimulus and a means to complement the effect and function of the elements of survival and fear, and never, I stress never, they did not diminish it. Consider, for example, one of the classic RE titles with no action elements. Is it still scary? Certainly. But is this fear depicted in a deeply engaging format, and does it mean anything at all? I think the answer is no. For example, if there were no action elements, there would never be anything based on inventory sorting and ammunition management, which is itself one of the major stressors of the genre. If it weren't for different weapons and their unique functions, the whole strategy in the game would have been lost and would have ended in running. As we mentioned in the previous section, fight or flight is a two-way process that gives you a choice according to the situation you are in. And this topic is very important in an interactive experience, because at the end of these experiences are intended to engage the player in their process and bridge between the player and the game world in order to influence its gameplay. Therefore, removing one element of this equation creates a mere unknown that you feel during your experience. The possibility of defense, weapons, and combat in various types of horror games have a direct relationship with how the elements of fear affect it and are the basis of survival elements. If you only want to run in a game, this process is repeated after a while, and each time you encounter enemies loses its freshness and distinction. But when you have a gun in your hand, there are different ways that can affect how you interact with fear. For example, when shooting at your enemy and suddenly the sound of click. You hear the gun being empty, your heart suddenly sheds, your heart beating faster, and your sense of fear and stress increases because now you're in a new situation where you have to think quickly and act according to the scenario, the environment, and the type of your enemies. Resident Evil 7 is always an example that I put forward in this discussion because I think it captures the dynamic between fear and action. And the rule of fight or flight artfully. You never rely entirely on your guns during the game, because although they offer a way to defend themselves, they ultimately have limitations and indiscriminate use, and it could cost you a lot. On the other hand, in the previous section, we said that many elements play a role in creating a sense of fear, and this game portrayed all these elements beautifully. From space to designing enemies and sounding, all were so great that they went in the head of the player and planted the seeds of constant fear in his brain and body. So these weapons were just ways to survive, not the way to salvation from fear. The first version of Evil Within could also be another good example of the excellent balance and interaction of fear and action, which beautifully implemented the elements of fear. Another positive feature of the possibility of defense and fighting in games, variety in the design and performance of enemies in order to balance and challenge the player, and the same elements of action, something that is not necessarily seen in games that are merely limited to walking, because to respond to the capabilities of the player that only leads to escape need to design deep and diverse enemies. It's not particularly about performance, because in the end, they mostly play the role of a stalker and follower. Of course, there are experiences in this branch that, despite the greater emphasis on fear and escape, still allow the player to use creative ways to defend himself. One of the best examples of this kind of survival horror is Haunting Ground, which built its gameplay mostly on chase and flight, but still had a very creative and interesting way of defending the player, just like an original survival horror effect. The alchemy system allows you to create items that you can use as traps or even aggressively against your stalker, and each has a distinct function but does not necessarily act like a weapon, or I should describe it differently. These items were mostly defensive and used not to kill enemies but to stop them, which in the end still remains a form of survival horror. Your faithful Huey dog could also attack those who chased you and help you fight or flight. On the other hand, although it didn't necessarily throw a large number of enemies at you, it had a great variety in the design of its pursuers, each of which in turn had different functions, characteristics, and weaknesses, and you had to take different approaches to confrontation and flight than any of them, just like a survival horror effect. Many other works follow this approach, the most recent of which is Amnesia the Bunker, so that you have a revolver and just like a survival horror effect, you have to constantly look for limited ammunition. But this gun doesn't actually kill the monster that follows you, but as a defensive weapon to create an escape window and complete the process. The chase is used in the game, which I think is a great and effective way to increase the feeling of fear and powerlessness, rather than completely removing this part and its belongings from the game's experience. Finally, we can say that the survival horror genre actually has two main types of games: titles that emphasize fear and depict action elements as limited and defensive, and titles that have deep and extensive action elements. But ultimately, both of these types of titles under the banner of this genre, and based on structure, standards, and the criteria, are made. Now that we have carefully considered the elements of action in survival horror, we come to another subcategory of horror works that use action elements widely, and that are action horror games. These are the works of whose main focus is the gameplay action dimension, and along with it, the elements of horror are also benefited. In other words, these works are titles whose scales of action are much heavier than their fears, and more than the general elements of fear. They also don't necessarily follow the rules, structure, and survival panic criteria, but are sometimes seen to inherit some characteristics, such as inventory management. Resident Evil 4, which is often mistakenly referred to by audiences as a survival horror effect, while structurally it does not fall into the survival horror category. In addition to RE4, Alan Wake and Fear is another example of this horror experience. As the name of such games is obvious, during their experience, the player has a lot more fighting tools, and in fact, the gameplay process, unlike hybrid and defensive survival horror style, changes to the offensive mode so that you move more to direct and self-demanding combat, and because of the abundance of ammunition as well as other ways of coping. Role fights. They are more pronounced than Fear in the process of the game, and here the rule of fight or flight revolves around more combat. In this kind of horror genre titles, the player relies much more on his fighting abilities, and even his strategies are changed to an offensive mode. But the problem is that action is used in this way in titles that also fall into the horror genre. Does not necessarily eliminate the fear, because although the main purpose of these works is to provide in the first place an enjoyable and deep action gameplay, and in the second stage inject a degree of fear into that experience. But the characteristics of these works best express this. Action works with elements of fear, so the intensity of the elements of fear can vary, and its only limitation is the level of creativity of the developer. These experiences don't eliminate anything entirely, but they do personalize these parts according to the purpose of the game. As I said, RE4 still inherits some elements of survival horror from its fathers, but in order to become an action-driven effect, it has removed some of them or implemented them in a different way. You can still consider these works to be the titles of Fear, because even some of these works, such as Fear, still have a very heavy atmosphere, sound and atmosphere that are the main elements of Fear. I think the title Fear can be a great roadmap for such works, because today, after nearly 2 decades, it still has a very high performance on its fears. Although the ratio of action to fear scenarios is higher, when the game enters its fear mode, it really scares you, and this is an art where you can pour weapons and various capabilities into the player's feet and still make him feel helpless in the skin of his bones. Finally, if we want to sum up this category, we should say that these works are just like survival horror titles, are deep, diverse, widespread, and respectable works in the topic of fear, which ultimately still contain both the elements of fear and action, follow the general structure of the fear genre, and the creators continue to build a deep and diverse experience and offer the player a choice, but they are committed to the player. The basis of the goal they pursue in presenting their experience will be more focused on the action discussion. But the last category of the horror genre that we want to talk about in action is precisely the one that has nothing to do with the action dimension. As I said, fear is an individual issue that everyone has a different approach to, but when it comes to video games, there's a new layer added to it, and that's gameplay, which is, as I said, the way to connect and touch many of the characteristics of horror games. But in the last decade, the works of walking simulator in the horror genre became highly popular, and a large amount of this popularity is due to YouTubers because they are great works for creating content. But with all due respect to the fans of this style of games, the method of selection of this category of titles in order to scare the player is very superficial and empty that generally after the first hour of the game experience, they are losing their effectiveness, but there are exceptions to this discussion. Imagine being tied up and left in a dark, abandoned building, even if there's nothing to be afraid of anyway, and that's pretty much what these kinds of fears do. The problem is that the fear of such games is imposed and does not arise from the loss of ideas, parts, and their chain interactions with each other. The game gives the player no choice but to flee and hide, and I see this as a weakness on the part of the creators. As I said, creating a balanced survival horror effect by following the structure and elements of the action is like walking on a narrow rope.
It requires a lot of precision and creativity.
So when the creator completely throws away the action part so that the player has no choice but to be forced to fear, this reduces the value of that effect as an interactive experience in this genre for me. Again, I should refer to this topic as Amnesia: The Bunker, because this game is exactly the descendant of a series that this kind of games widely raised. But today we see that its creators are advancing their work so that instead of changing the structure and identity of their works, adding Revolver to this version officially, how the usual process, they change the effects like this. This may seem like a small, but the point is that the creators now allow the player to find its own solution to the various situations they encounter during their experience, which is one of the main features of the genre. Instead of escape being the only way to survive now, you have another way, and that's using your weapon. But each of the bullets in this gun is like gold, and this is another prominent feature of the genre. So now it's possible for the player to adopt different approaches to his situation. It's kind of like reversing the horror effects of the action, as the main goal is fear, but the action is also injected into the process through elements and constructive creativity. But when the action part is completely eliminated, it's just erasing the face of an issue that the creator seems to have no interest in answering. Don't get me wrong, there are such good experiences in this genre that are still creative in their structure, but if we want to measure structurally, these titles are exactly the same equations that are unknown on one side, and I really get the feeling of imperfection from them and quickly become repetitive and uniform for me. Some of today's creators mistakenly think that the existence of action mechanisms in the horror effects will eliminate their fear and use the same excuse to remove the action part altogether, because if we want to look honestly, this will make the process of making the game much easier. But this is while they simply have no ability or intention to balance it. And even if we want to consider it in terms of success, this structure is very successful because more casual horror audiences enjoy them a lot. So the result of following it is sometimes less work and relative success is certain. That's why today the horror genre is full of repetitive and non-creative walking simulator experiences, where the creator's laziness is well known, but you still see a large audience referred to as wonderful works, while only a glance at the sixth generation and the horrors of that time shows how fresh and different and attractive the ideas were. Even to this day, some of them have not been repeated. As I mentioned before, such works, due to the removal of an essential part of their structure, also remove many of the attributes associated with it, including the diversity of enemies, which ultimately result in the opposite in the context of fear. Finally, it can be concluded that by eliminating one of the basic parts of the horror genre, these works offer a compulsory one-way experience that aims only to intimidate and stop, and this is somewhat similar to the situation of the horror genre in cinema, which nowadays the majority of films are quite similar. In terms of fiction and the process of scaring them, and the standard of audiences has been so low. In the eyes of many films such as Insidious, Annabelle, or even The Conjuring, all of which are repeated repeatedly, have become the scariest horror movies of today's horror movies, while all are merely using the oldest gimmick in the Book of Fear. Scary walking simulator titles are exactly the same works that, in my view, by omitting one of the main sections that have always been complementary to balancing and optimizing the element of fear, they become more surface and more uniform titles that rarely happen, in which we rarely see any particular innovation or creativity. While we can give countless examples of experiences, have action, but sometimes have a much higher yield than these ones that want to dip fear into the player's face. But after looking at the different types of horror titles and their approaches to action elements, it's time to answer the question of whether action elements actually undermine the sense of fear. I think after all this, it is clear that the answer is no. The problem is that action, self-defense, fighting, or whatever you want to call it, complement fear not only in video games, but even in real life and our own encounters with fear. Fight or escape is exactly a two-way and interdependent process, so that sometimes you need to stop and run away, and sometimes you have no escape, so you have to stand up and fight for survival, even if all you can do is throw your fists. So when you remove one of these two actions completely from the process of an effect, it causes the effect. Make the experience look much more artificial and feel that the builder is trying to force fear in your head. For example, if, in reality, when you walk into a mental asylum and you see corpses there in the middle of the night, the first thing you do is look for a means of self-defense. But some creators think that the best way to survive is video camera. It is as if the character does not have the consciousness of the situation in which he is in and is merely capable of following an action. But there is always the possibility that the creators will act in the direction of embedding the action elements just like extreme fear and completely disturb the balance of the game. But the issue is that this section provides a vast space for the game's developers to innovate and be creative, from the design of weapons and their performance to the design of enemies and the design of scenarios that challenge the impact of the game's process of action and connects these elements directly to fear. Finally, we can conclude that the action dimension in the horror gameplay is not only not an alien part, but it also provides and complements many elements and events that are directly related to the game's fear trigger, so its total elimination from a game can definitely damage the structure, process, and impact of its fear. Fear, as we have said, enters your mind into survival mode, and action elements are your way of connecting with the game world, and feedback on the fear drive, just like the real world. The more flexible these action elements are, the more natural and pure you can react to fear and establish a dynamic connection to the game's process, fear, elements, and ultimately confrontation that not only never ends but constantly reinforces each other. And finally, we came to the end of another horror video where we dealt with a subject around which there are different opinions. The message we can get from all of our talk today is that action and fear are the only tools and pieces of the puzzle that the creator has in hand with the idea and is responsible for using them efficiently and appropriately. If the builder fails to make optimal use of this tool, the end result is an experience that may be completely in crisis of identity. But if properly exploited these capacities and elements, we will see a trend in which fear and action constantly reinforce each other. What do you think about this topic? Do you think action will eliminate fear in games?